Turn off the engine and step out. Why doesn't this ID match what I'm seeing?
The card cleared. What specific issue are you identifying, officer?
The rain in Northern Virginia at 5 in the morning does not fall. It hangs in the air like a cold gray mist clinging to the concrete brutalism of the Pentagon. General Marcus Vance sat behind the wheel of his personal SUV, the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers the only sound inside the quiet cabin. He was a 4-star general in the United States Army, the commander of over 50,000 active-duty troops across a massive geographical theater. He had commanded armored divisions in the desert, overseen multi-billion-dollar logistical supply chains, and briefed the President of the United States. But right now, he was just a man in a dark civilian suit, tired, sipping lukewarm black coffee from a travel mug, trying to mentally prepare for a grueling Joint Chiefs budget meeting. Because of a last-minute schedule change and a mechanical issue with his assigned staff car, Vance had opted to drive himself. He hadn't bothered to put on his uniform at home, preferring to keep the crisp green fabric free of wrinkles, leaving it neatly pressed in a garment bag draped across the back seat. He approached the secure vehicle checkpoint, the glow of the halogen security lights cutting through the early morning fog. Officer David Miller of the Pentagon Force Protection Agency stood inside the guard booth, a young man a few years out of a civilian police academy, wearing a high-visibility yellow jacket over his tactical gear. Miller had been on shift for 10 hours. He was tired, running on caffeine and routine, filtering the thousands of faces that passed through his lane through a mental Rolodex of threat profiles and heuristics. As Vance's SUV rolled to a stop at the heavy steel barriers, he rolled down his window, letting the cold, damp air rush into the heated car. Vance extended his hand, holding out his common access card. The standard-issue Department of Defense cryptographic ID. Miller took the card. He looked at the face on the plastic, a digitally printed photograph of a stern, middle-aged black man. He looked up at the driver's seat. The man in the car matched the photograph. Miller swiped the card through the handheld scanner. A loud affirmative beep echoed in the booth and the screen flashed green. The digital readout confirmed the card's validity. It displayed the name, Marcus Vance, and it displayed the rank, O10, General. Miller's thumb hovered over the button that would lower the hydraulic barricades. He looked at the screen again. O10, 4-star General. Then he looked back at the man in the car. He saw a black man in his late 50s, driving a slightly muddy Honda Pilot, wearing a generic dark raincoat over a civilian suit. Miller's mind, shaped by years of absorbing subtle cultural assumptions and Hollywood depictions of what a high-ranking military officer looked like, stumbled over a cognitive dissonance. A 4-star general arrives in a chauffeured black Suburban with tinted windows. A 4-star general has a security detail. A 4-star general doesn't look like this, alone, in a mid-size family SUV at dawn. The cryptographic scanner told Miller the truth, but Miller's internal bias whispered a different story. In law enforcement, relying on that whisper is how procedures begin to unravel. "Is there a problem, officer?" Vance asked, his voice calm, a deep baritone that carried the effortless authority of a man who had spent 3 decades giving orders that meant life or death. "Turn the engine off, sir," Miller said, stepping out of the booth and resting his hand casually on his duty belt just inches from his sidearm. It was a subtle shift in posture, but to Vance, who had spent his entire life navigating the precarious tightrope of being a black man in America, it was as loud as a siren. "My ID cleared," Vance stated, keeping his hands clearly visible on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. "I have a briefing in the E-ring in 45 minutes. Lower the barricade, please." "I need you to turn off the engine and hand me your keys," Miller repeated, his tone hardening, the protective shell of authority snapping into place. "And I need you to step out of the vehicle." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the patter of the rain. General Vance did not shout. He did not immediately invoke his rank to crush the junior officer. He possessed a profound understanding of the law, not just military code, but constitutional law. "Officer," Vance began, his voice dropping in volume but increasing in intensity, "this is an administrative checkpoint. Its legal purpose, under the military installation exception to the Fourth Amendment, is to inspect vehicles for explosives or contraband to ensure base security. I have submitted to that process. You have scanned a federally issued cryptographic identification card. It has digitally verified my identity. Unless you are telling me that you have discovered a bomb in my vehicle, your administrative authority to delay my entry has concluded." Miller blinked, slightly taken aback by the clinical precision of the response, but his ego anchored him to his initial assumption. "I'm verifying your identity, sir. There's been a lot of stolen valor and fake IDs lately. I don't believe this ID belongs to you. You're not a real general. Vance's jaw tightened. You don't believe it. Tell me, officer, what is the legal standard you are applying right now? Because to detain me beyond the scope of a routine administrative gate check to seize my person, you require reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime is afoot. That is the standard set by Terry versus Ohio. So I am asking you to articulate the specific facts that lead you to suspect this federally authenticated ID is fraudulent. Is the photograph incorrect? Did the cryptographic chip fail? You don't fit the profile of an O10, Miller said, the words slipping out before he could filter them, a devastating admission of bias masquerading as police work. Generals don't roll up unescorted in a Honda. Step out of the car, now. Vance knew he could make one phone call and end this. He knew he could yell, command, and threaten, but he also knew the grim reality of the statistics. He was a large black man in an argument with an armed, tense law enforcement officer in the dark. The metal stars on his uniform, currently packed away in the back seat, would not stop a 9mm hollow-point bullet if Miller panicked. The Constitution is a shield in a courtroom, but it is rarely bulletproof on the pavement. Slowly, deliberately, Vance turned off the engine. He pulled the keys from the ignition and dropped them onto the dashboard where they clattered loudly. He opened the door and stepped out into the freezing rain. The moment Vance was out of the car, the power dynamic shifted entirely into a realm of procedural failure. Miller reached for his radio. Dispatch, I need a secondary unit at Gate 3. Possible 1031, fraudulent ID, uncooperative subject. He turned back to Vance. Stand at the rear of the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them. Vance walked to the rear of his SUV, the rain beginning to soak through his suit jacket. He placed his hands flat on the wet metal of the trunk. You are making a profound procedural error, officer, Vance said quietly. You have transformed an administrative security check into an investigative detention without reasonable suspicion. Your stated reason is that I do not fit the profile. Bias is not a substitute for probable cause. You are currently violating my Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure. Save the law degree for the judge, Miller scoffed, his adrenaline masking his growing unease at how calm his suspect was. A patrol cruiser pulled up moments later, its red and blue lights slicing through the fog, reflecting off the wet pavement. Another PFPA officer, a slightly older man named Jenkins, stepped out. What do we got? Jenkins asked, eyeing Vance, who stood perfectly still, rain dripping from his closely cropped hair. Guy handed me an O10 CAC. System flashed green, but it's obviously a fake, Miller said. Look at him. Look at the car. He's trying to talk his way out of it using a bunch of legal jargon. I'm going to clear the vehicle. Officer, Vance spoke up, projecting his voice over the idling engine of the cruiser, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. You have detained me on the suspicion of a fraudulent ID. A claim entirely manufactured by your own prejudice. A search of the passenger compartment of my vehicle will not yield evidence of a fake ID that you are already holding in your hand. Therefore, you lack probable cause for a vehicle search under the automobile exception. And a search incident to arrest is invalid because I am not under arrest. Jenkins hesitated, looking from Vance to Miller. The suspect was using precise terminology. He wasn't erratic. He was deeply, unsettlingly composed. Miller, did the scanner greenlight the card? Jenkins asked quietly. Yeah, but those chips can be cloned, Miller insisted, doubling down to protect his initial judgment. I'm checking the car. Miller walked to the open driver's side door, leaned in, and began visually inspecting the interior. He reached into the back seat, his hand brushing against the thick canvas of the garment bag lying across the seats. He unzipped it. Inside, perfectly pressed, was an army green service uniform jacket. On the shoulders were the heavy silver insignias of a 4-star general. On the left breast was a fruit salad of ribbons spanning 35 years of service, including the Silver Star and the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. Miller pulled the jacket out, holding it up in the rain. Look at this, Miller called out, a triumphant smirk crossing his face. Stolen valor. Guy's got a 4-star uniform in the back. He's impersonating a general. Vance closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the cold rain mix with a profound, exhausting sorrow. It wasn't just the indignity of the moment, it was the systemic predictability of it. The officer had found the exact proof of Vance's identity, and his bias was so deeply entrenched that he weaponized the proof against him. The uniform wasn't evidence of truth to Miller, it was evidence of a deeper lie, because Miller's worldview fundamentally could not accommodate the reality standing in front of him. You're in a lot of trouble, buddy, Miller said, walking toward Vance with the jacket draped over one arm, reaching for his handcuffs with the other. Do not put those cuffs on me, Vance said. The absolute, uncompromising authority of a theater commander finally bled into his voice. It wasn't a yell, it was a frequency that vibrated with immense, quiet power. Jenkins, the older officer, froze. He recognized that tone. It wasn't the tone of a sovereign citizen or a con artist. It was the tone of a man who moved divisions. At that moment, the screech of tires echoed through the checkpoint. A white Ford Explorer with a supervisor's light bar pulled up violently. Out stepped Captain Harris, the shift commander. Harris was a veteran of the force, a man who knew every face in the high command because his job depended on it. He jogged toward the group, pulling his radio cord tight. "What is going on here, Miller? Why is this lane blocked?" Miller pointed to Vance. "Captain, we have a suspect presenting a fake O10 CAC, impersonating a general officer. Found this jacket in his car." Harris looked at Miller, then looked at the jacket. He saw the nameplate on the right breast, Vance. Harris slowly turned his head to look at the man standing at the back of the SUV. The rain was slicking down the man's face, but the broad shoulders, the unyielding posture, and the piercing cold eyes were unmistakable. Harris had just attended a base security briefing 2 days prior, where they discussed the upcoming Joint Chiefs Budget Summit. A massive photo of General Marcus Vance had been on the projector screen. All the blood drained from Captain Harris's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. "Miller," Harris said, his voice trembling slightly, "put the jacket back in the car, carefully." "Sir, he's—" "Shut your mouth and put the general's jacket back in the vehicle," Harris roared, the panic finally breaking through. He practically shoved Miller aside and jogged over to the rear of the SUV, coming to a sharp, textbook position of attention in the pouring rain. "General Vance, sir, I am profoundly sorry. I am Captain Harris, shift supervisor. Please step out of the rain." Miller stood frozen by the open car door, his hand still resting on his handcuffs. The cognitive dissonance shattered, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. He looked at the ID in his hand. It wasn't a clone, it wasn't a fake. It was real. The man was real. Vance did not move. He looked at Harris, then looked at Miller. "Captain," Vance said, his voice steady, devoid of the theatrical anger one might expect. "Your officer detained me without reasonable suspicion. He explicitly stated that I did not fit the profile of a general officer. He then conducted an illegal search of my vehicle without probable cause, consent, or a warrant, finding my uniform and using it to justify his predetermined conclusion. We are sworn to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. Your officer just trampled the Fourth Amendment because he could not fathom that a black man in a Honda Pilot could outrank him." "Sir, there is no excuse," Harris stammered, his uniform getting soaked. "I will have him removed from duty immediately. I will personally escort you to the E-ring." "You will not escort me," Vance said, stepping away from the vehicle. "I know the way. You will log this incident. You will secure all body camera and dash camera footage. I expect a formal report on my desk from the Inspector General's office by 0900 tomorrow regarding the procedural failures at this checkpoint. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, General." Vance walked to the driver's side of his car. He stopped and looked at Miller, who was staring at the asphalt, completely silent, his career flashing before his eyes. The reality of the situation was not a movie. Vance was not going to strip Miller of his badge on the spot. The military and federal government operate on bureaucracy, investigations, and union reps. The consequences for Miller would be real: a suspension, a devastating internal affairs investigation, a likely transfer or termination, but they would happen slowly, in sterile rooms with paperwork. But the moral consequence was immediate. "You didn't see me, Officer Miller," Vance said quietly, the words cutting through the rain sharper than any knife. "You saw a ghost of your own making. You looked at a system that told you the truth, and you chose to believe your prejudice instead. If you cannot trust the facts over your feelings, you have no business wearing a badge." Vance got into his car. He took his keys from the dashboard, started the engine, and put the vehicle in drive. Harris manually overrode the system, dropping the barricades. General Marcus Vance drove into the sprawling parking lot of the Pentagon, leaving the 3 officers standing in the rain, the flashing lights of the cruiser reflecting off the wet pavement like a warning beacon. As Vance parked his car in his reserved spot and finally reached back to grab his uniform, the weight of the morning settled over him. He was about to walk into a room and command the attention of the most powerful military leaders on the planet. He held the lives of 50,000 soldiers in his hands. Yet, 20 minutes ago, his freedom, his dignity, and potentially his life were entirely at the mercy of a frightened young man's flawed assumptions. It was a staggering juxtaposition, a reminder that no amount of stars on a collar can shield a person from the pervasive, systemic flaws of a society still wrestling with its own shadow. The procedural errors made at that gate were not born of malice, but of a quiet, insidious bias that corrupts the very foundation of justice. The assumption of guilt based on identity rather than action. When you strip away the uniform, the rank, and the protocol, what is left is the law. The Fourth Amendment was designed to protect citizens from arbitrary harassment, to ensure that law enforcement must rely on objective facts, not subjective feelings. But the law is only as strong as the people tasked with enforcing it. When those people allow their personal heuristics to override their training, the Constitution becomes just another piece of paper in the rain. Ask yourself this. If a man who has reached the absolute pinnacle of military achievement, armed with undeniable federal proof of his identity, can be unlawfully detained and searched simply because he doesn't look the part, how vulnerable are those who have no stars to protect them? Real justice doesn't just demand that we follow the procedures. It demands that we confront the hidden biases that make us ignore those procedures in the first place.